All right. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews, where we talk about leftist books and sometimes not leftist books.
Yeah, this book tonight is definitely not a leftist one. This book is going to be very hard to categorize exactly how it fits. But anyway,
Okay.
thank you for having me, Cory. Excited to be here.
For sure.
So tonight we're going to be talking about, every once in a while on the podcast, and for our audience, please humor us. Every once in a while, we're going to read a book that sort of is what I would call from sort of the normie verse. It's a book that's not like, real, like actual, like left theory. It's a book that's sort of mainstream political writing. And it's a lot. This book was a lot more mainstream than I thought it was going to be.
Right?
and it's, but I think it's worthwhile to talk about because this book is a nice springboard to discuss something that I think has been in the discourse for a while and something I think having a conversation about would be interesting, more so than necessarily the book itself. And so the book tonight is called The New Class War. I think the subtitle is Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite by Michael Lind. Michael Lind is, I think he's actually a professor of government at the LBJ School of Government in Austin, Texas, in the UT Austin campus. He is one of the founders of what is called New America. It was originally called the New America Foundation, which is a sort of centrist think tank.
Oh, good. That's what we need.
So this guy belongs to what Tariq Ali would call the extreme center. Or the radical center.
The radical centrists.
But he's weird in that most people who are sort of radical centrists are sort of liberal like they're like sort of like liberal, like socially, and then they're like economically conservative.
Yeah, that's what they like to call themselves anyway.
Yeah, like socially liberal, but economically conservative. Like you're sort of Emmanuel Macron types, right? Like Michael Lind is like the complete opposite. So he's like economically liberal, or what I would say is like economically sort of broadly what could be described as social democratic. Okay. And sort of the American liberal tradition, because in America, of course, we use words differently than everybody else does. Right. So liberal in most of the world is, what would sort of in America be we would call sort of libertarian, or sort of like broadly, sort of free markets, open trade, free trade, right, deregulation. Like that's what liberal generally means for most of the world. But in America, liberal sort of means actually more close to like social democratic. So like his economic ideas are actually fairly social democratic to a point, but then his social views are quite conservative.
Oh, okay.
But he holds them in like ways that are not like, they're not like outwardly bigoted in the sense that like he's not like a Tucker Carlson, he's not a Brett Stevens. It's more of like he
relies on the system to do his bigotry for him.
He relies on the system, and he relies on the sort of tyranny of capitalist realism to sort of do that for him. His horizon of possibility in terms of what we can do with the world is surprisingly small. Like he just doesn't he doesn't think that certain things are possible. But the reason I wanted to read this book was it had been floating around for a while, and there are other like books that sort of tackle this, some from the left. Like there's a book called Virtue Hoarders, which is another book that sort of is in this vein, that's more explicitly of the left. But what this book does is it tries to essentially criticize what we would today, and what was called by Barbara Ehrenreich and other scholars, what they call the professional managerial class. Mm-hmm. So Michael Lind's argument sort of in the beginning of the book is he talks about how this sort of basic Marxist notion of the ruling class and the working class, the ruling class being the owning class, they own the means of production, and the workers who have to live on a wage and don't own the means of the production, that dichotomy is essentially dead, that no one really believes it anymore, and that it doesn't really work to understand. It's not really applicable to the modern age in which we live in. And
that's a very liberal notion.
Very liberal notion. This is where it gets quite liberal, like in the small L sense.
Right.
And what he's sort of arguing for instead is that there's this sort of managerial class and this sort of managerial elite who sets the tone for everything else. And so, so people who were like CEOs of corporations, right? So like
Right.
if you or from a CEO of a corporation all the way down to like the associate like manager of like an Applebee's, right? Like they're all kind of a part of that sort of professional managerial class.
Okay.
It also includes government workers. So like by Lynn's definition, I'm a part of the professional managerial class because
Right.
I'm college educated. I work in the knowledge economy and I'm like I don't have like the traditional sort of worker owner relationship because I work for the state. So
Right. Okay.
it's a kind of a different situation. But his whole thing is that because the managerial elite essentially control our economic system, they control our political system, they control our economic system, and they control our culture.
Right. Yeah. I suppose like he means like with your like economists and your like you say CEOs and whatnot, they make the major decisions or they make the policies up essentially.
Exactly. And so the traditional notions of the sort of neoliberal model, because his book is quite critical of neoliberalism.
Okay.
That's like the good part,
right?
You know, where he's sort of talking about the fact that the neoliberal model of just sort of free markets, free trade, you know, all of this has been largely detrimental to most Americans.
Right.
And to, quite frankly, most people in sort of the industrialized world, that when jobs go away, people's livelihoods go away, income inequality skyrockets. And on top of all of that, you have rises in sort of deaths of despair, whether it's, you know, alcohol abuse, the opioid crisis, you know, increases in gun violence, you know, and it's all about the pattern of like, we were sold a bill of goods on the idea of neoliberalism in the 1980s and 90s, and the promise of that was never fulfilled. And on that regard, I agree with him. And we've talked about that on the show before. You know, for those who are newer to the podcast, if you check out our episode on David Harvey and the brief history of neoliberalism, we go into that in more detail.
Yeah.
But where he's sort of getting this idea is the idea that he's discussing of this managerial elite. He's not getting it from nothing. It comes from somewhere. And really, it kind of ties back to a thinker from the 1950s and 60s named James Burnham.
Okay.
And James Burnham was your typical sort of neoconservative. He was a radical socialist. He was a Marxist. He was a member, I believe he was a member of the Communist Party at one point, and leaves communism behind and becomes like a virulent anti-communist and conservative.
Okay.
Which a lot of intellectuals did. Part of that was because, you know, the Congress of Cultural Freedom and, you know, a lot of these other sort of cultural institutions that were nominally left in the United States or in Western Europe during the 1950s and 60s were actually sort of, some of them were partly funded by the CIA. And so it was sort of an ideas industry that had been sort of bought and captured by the United States sort of national security state. So
right.
Burnham is a part of that. And he's sort of and so he maintains the sort of class conflict, but instead of it being those who own the system versus those who have to work in order to survive, he really separates it to those who manage society and those who don't. And so the lines between who owns a society and who doesn't get rather blurry. This is where it's in service of capitalism, right? So it's like if we lose that sort of very clear delineation that like whether you are somebody who works for the government or or somebody who works in the private sector, like I work for wage. Like I don't own the means of production. I don't own the government any more than anybody else does. The government is owned by everyone and no one kind of at the same time. And so, and so like, I'm not like, I am a working class person because I have to earn a wage to survive. Now, mind you, I'm a salaried person, but if you break it down, it's a certain amount every hour. It's not any different than if I was, you know, somebody who was either working in food or I was a truck driver or I was a plumber or whatever. Generally, most people in America, most people around the world have to sort of work for a wage, right? And I think that muddying those waters is very destructive to, I think, real emancipatory politics. Right. Because right out the gate, I mean, we're talking right out the gate, Lind basically just dismisses the idea of socialism in general. This is where this is where the capitalist realism component of the book comes in, where he just can't imagine socialism even working.
Right.
And so he's just like, well, obviously socialism's off the table. We're not even going to discuss that. It's not even possible.
That's not what this book is about.
It's not what this book is about. And so when he says like saving democracy, what he actually really means is saving the sort of nominally sort of social democratic capitalist government of the United States.
Right.
And I think his model for what he really would like to kind of go back to is what a lot of, I think, liberals or social democrats or democratic socialists kind of look back at, and we've talked about on the show, the sort of what's called like the Great Convergence.
Right.
Which happens between the 1930s and the 1970s in the United States. There's this real great convergence where income inequality goes down, standard of living goes up, social democratic institutions expand, and their services expand. This is the age which brings on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Head Start programs, essentially, FDR's New Deal, LBJ's Great Society, right? Like that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And Lind sort of says that like that model, this model of like a robust capitalist order who with firm guardrails that are set not just by regulatory policy, but by social democratic policy, like social democratic programs that sort of soften the edges of the capitalist system.
Right.
That's what's possible. Like that's the most extreme we can get.
Okay.
Now, would that system be better than what we have now? Yes. Yes,
Sure.
it would. But I think it doesn't really get to the heart of the real issue, which is that it leaves the capitalist relations intact. It doesn't really challenge them. And so, because he doesn't really talk about work cooperatives.
Right.
He doesn't talk about employee-owned businesses. He does talk nominally about maybe nationalizing some industries. This is the good stuff of the book in the sense that like broader sort of democratic control of the economy, broader social democratic programs that benefit, the benefit the poor, like all of those are good things.
Yeah.
But the problem is that you cannot really have those without a firm political movement that is dedicated to it, right? Like the New Deal happened because there was a very expansive left in the United States that sort of made it happen.
Yeah.
They were the ones who sort of made it was possible. It made it possible for the New Deal to happen because otherwise there were mass strikes. There were political organizations that measured in the hundreds of thousands, whether it was the American Socialist Party or the American Communist Party, that advocated for the kinds of reforms that would end up becoming components of the New Deal and the Great Society. And so when you narrow your horizons, you lose the capacity to get more than you even imagined.
Yeah,
this is something that we'll talk about when we talk about Leszek Kolakowski's book, Marxist Humanism, is he makes the argument of like, go for the most radical position.
Right.
And say like, that's where, and it's not the most radical position, but like in American politics, right? The idea of Medicare for all was just like kind of unheard of, 10 years ago, at the height of the Obamacare debate, the height of healthcare reform in Obama's first term, even the public option was killed.
Right.
So like, even though the public overwhelmingly supported the public option, and everybody said like the independent studies showed that a public option would not just improve care, but it would lower costs. Like everybody knew this was a good thing that would work, and it was shown to work, but of course we couldn't have it. And so you go even further, right? You don't just say, well, public option, whatever. No, Medicare for all. It's simple, right? And then you can go even farther than that and say decommodify healthcare.
Yeah.
Decommodify the system. Nationalize the hospitals, nationalize the insurance companies, nationalize the pharmaceutical industries, put them under democratic control. Like that's the even more radical position, right?
Yeah.
So even if you take that position and what you end up with is Medicare for all, it's still better than if you had said just a public option and then you get, the sort of patchwork system that ended up becoming the Affordable Care Act, which again, a lot of good policy in the Affordable Care Act, but it all hinged on the marketplace system working, and that fell apart.
Right. Yeah. Better than nothing, but still not good.
And this is where I feel like it's his failure, Michael Lind's like failure of vision, to acknowledge that like what the social democratic vision of mid 20th century, social democracy or democratic socialism or sort of high liberalism, whatever you want to call it, it was predicated on social movements doing the work to ensure that the public would get what they sort of wanted, and that they would hold politicians accountable for it.
Right.
There is no natural constituency for the kind of political program that Michael Lind wants.
Mm-hmm.
Like no one would really want it. And part of it is it's because he'll get a lot of progressives or social democrats on board with some of his policies, but he's going to lose them on his other policies,
right.
which is that he is extremely anti-immigration. So
how does he propose you make this system work without immigration?
So basically, he argues for legal immigration, but essentially what he's arguing for is in order to build the sort of economic system that sort of wrests away control from either the capitalist class, the owning class, or the managerial class. In order to take it, you have to build a program that people will get behind. And the problem is he essentially makes the argument that if we build a system that has broader social democratic programs with a sort of mixed, heavily regulated capitalist economy, it will not allow for the high levels of immigration that what he calls the left wants, but it's not really the left. It's more like the sort of liberal progressive set. I mean, it is right. The left, but it's like the farthest right of the left. You know what I mean? Yeah. So again, it's his sort of failure of vision. He has
just the guys that are slightly left of him.
Slightly left of him, right? Like it's again, his Overton window is very small.
Right.
So it's not, he can't seem to think about whether or not we could build like a robust sort of mixed economy with social democracy and have, essentially what he argues is open borders, which again, other than people who are actually political radicals like anarchists who argue for no borders, no one argues that. No one in mainstream political discourse says no borders, or just fully blown open borders. No one does in mainstream political discourse.
Yeah, that's right.
But he's sort of arguing that like Democrats are essentially the same as anarchists on this issue, which is absurd.
Which no anarchist will agree.
No anarchist would ever agree, and no Democrat would agree.
Right.
Like that's my whole thing too. Is so what he basically says is it's not only do we want to curtail or essentially attempt to eliminate illegal immigration, but that we actually have to curb back on legal immigration.
Oh, geez.
And essentially only really allow in. And he makes the divide between highly skilled versus low skilled workers. He makes that divide, and says, well, we can allow in high skilled workers and not low skilled workers. But again, it's a failure of vision, right? So if you're building a broader social democratic system, then you can, and you actually like tax the rich, like you actually build a tax system that's more equitable and fair so that not only are we paying for the programs we have now, but we can actually expand them.
Right.
And it reminds me very much of, because I've been rereading about the Obama era recently and just thinking about it a little bit. And, during the peak of the Affordable Care Act debate, the Obamacare debate, one of the things the Republicans often said was, oh, it's going to allow the subsidies under the healthcare reform to go to illegal immigrants. And they kept saying that. But the thing was, in the law itself, on like page 17 or something like that, it literally says in plain English in black and white, healthcare subsidies will not go to undocumented aliens, essentially, undocumented workers. Like it says it right in the language, and they lied anyway.
Yeah.
So, and so I think it's like part of the problem with immigration is it's not so much the immigration itself that's the problem. The real problem is a public which has been told to be absolutely scared shitless about immigrants.
Right.
It's the Donald Trump stuff, right? Because what Michael Lind's program is essentially what Trump did during his time as president, where not only did they tried to cut back on illegal immigration, obviously the horrific treatment of people at the
Yeah.
border by ICE, the kids in cages. It was horrific.
Yeah.
But also curbing actual legal immigration,
Yeah.
like real limits on legal immigration, because for about 100 years, the United States has had a fairly stringent immigration system. Like, people think that like people can just come and go through the United States, and that's absolutely not true.
Right.
Like, I think I think The Economist recently reported that through Trump's entire presidency, he only let in like 15,000 refugees. That was it. You know, I think Biden has done 33,000 so far. So it goes to show you that even under a more sort of broader progressive policy, it's still not that big, right?
That's far from open borders.
It's far from open borders. So like the Trump administration, they curbed illegal immigration, but they also curbed legal immigration. Mm-hmm. Because Lynn's whole argument is it's like this has to be predicated on a culture that we have to take back from the managerial elite. Now, you can kind of read into that what you will. The crappiest interpretation of that is that like he's essentially talking about like Jews or something, like making like, but that's not.
You might hear the same language from someone else, and it would be that. But
yeah, like you can make that argument, but like I'm not, because I think that's a straw man, and I don't think it's
what he's actually saying.
What I think he's really actually saying is that the American public are generally more culturally conservative, and so. That they're more culturally conservative. Sorry about that. That they're more culturally conservative. And as a result, they're not going to necessarily go on board with, broader sort of, social policy, which might benefit illegal immigrants or might benefit, immigrants in general, or might benefit members of certain marginalized communities. He is somebody who writes syndicated columns. His book is actually far more intelligent than his syndicated columns. His syndicated columns, because I wanted to get kind of more background on him.
Oh, yeah.
And I read more of his syndicated columns, and he's one of those people who throws around the word woke left and right.
Ugh. Yeah.
And it's really frustrating.
The woke mind virus.
The woke mind virus. I genuinely believe that, if the moment that I hear somebody unironically using the word woke to be like to make some political point, I am legitimately already bored. Yeah. Like I'm not just appalled, I'm bored, because it's such an easy way to say it. Because Lynn's argument on some of this is that the sort of corporate class is captured by these sort of managerial elite types who are highly educated, whose values are far more sort of progressive or tolerant than like the average American, essentially.
Okay.
So like the yokels be racist, and I think that's absurd, because I think a lot of working class people, first off, not all working class people are like, I don't know, like Joe Sixpack with his metal lunch pail going in the coal mines.
Right. Yeah. It's pretty rare, actually.
It's actually extremely rare. Like, more people work in the, I think I can't remember, like more people, somebody made this, and more people work at JCPenney than work in coal mining in the United States.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And that's JCPenney. We're not even talking about like Walmart or Amazon or Target or any of the other big retailers. I'm talking about a smaller, dying retailer.
That's one of those things that they were talking about, like during the 2020 election, I think it was, because the working class or what have you, it's like America is a consumer class country, so it has a lot of retail stores, it has a lot of retail employees, it doesn't have a lot of production.
Yes, that's right.
So it's rather silly to think like that they've got all these like you say, construction workers and
yeah, it's
and miners.
The consumer class is closer to what it is. Like, it's not, it's not in the sense that America made a bargain, sometime in the 1970s, that the way in order to keep our economy kind of chugging along was moving away from production and into consumption.
Right.
And that had real problems. I mean, as the pandemic has shown us, that when we offshored so much of what we do, and we create supply chains that are so globalized that it can create it can wreak real havoc on the economy. And that's something he talks about in the book that I think is a legitimate thing. Like, I think it's important for national economies to build supply chains that are not so fully dependent upon the global economy, in the sense that, like, when you have crises, that we can then build things like ventilators.
Right.
Like, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, it was really hard to get American like manufacturing plants to like make ventilators because like
Right.
they just didn't.
Yeah.
Same thing with masks. It's, we killed our industrial base in the United States, and we have we've sort of suffered the consequences ever since.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a real concern. I think that we should have government policy which incentivizes domestic production. Yeah. I'm not protectionist in the sense that I do believe that like it's impossible. I think the toothpaste is out of the tube. There's no way of, in terms of globalization, like we're never going back.
Right.
But what I think we should do is, instead of these sort of broader trade agreements, which harm like the domestic population of countries at the expense of other countries, I think it's better to have, instead of a sort of fully integrated system, you have to have what I would call an interdependent system, where national economies have their own systems of production, but at the same time, they also have connections to the global economy. I mean, I think if part of the reason why Lind is sort of against a lot of the immigration is because if you allow in this influx of immigrants who will need jobs, the problem is that like the domestic residents of the United States or naturalized citizens, that they will sort of be bothered by that idea, because essentially it's a race to the bottom, right? So like when the managerial elite in the United States argue for broader immigration, they're not doing it because they're compassionate for people around the world.
It's not because they're progressive.
It's an economic argument. And that is something that I think has changed a lot. I mean, I think like most mainstream Democrats up until about 10 years ago, or this sort of progressive movement, was not so gung-ho on immigration. Right. In fact, it was kind of the other way around. I mean, conservatives were often more pro-immigration. That was something George W. Bush very much supported and tried to pass a major comprehensive immigration reform package, which was co-sponsored by John McCain. So like and it was purely economic.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was a way to suppress wages. And so like Lynn says that you cannot build like the real broader economy that will work for the American people if you constantly let all these immigrants who will work for less. And if they work for less, they're going to suppress wages down. So
he just wouldn't accept that, no, we actually have to impose some regulations on these businesses so that they don't lower the wages.
Bingo. Part of it is it's actually, and one thing I will give him credit for is that he's very pro-union. He thinks that unions are an essential part of this sort of broader new sort of social democratic system. But again, look at the 10% of the American workforce that is unionized today. Okay. If you look at a lot of them, many of them are women and many of them are women of color.
Yeah.
A lot of them are second or third generation Americans, a lot of whom may be dreamers, meaning that they came here when they were children and they've been here their whole lives, but yet they're undocumented. Like, there's all of those concerns. So like the country, the demographics of the country are changing, and he's not making the kind of like shitty, like extreme, like Tucker Carlson arguments.
Right. He's not saying like it's a replacement of, essentially white replacement, right? And
he doesn't really care about that, and it's not a thing. I think what he's more concerned about is that it's either you have a social democratic system for a population, or you have broader immigration and free trade, but you cannot have both. And I think that, again, I just think it's a failure of vision. The other thing he talked about in terms of culture that really bothered me, and this actually harkens back to our episode on Daniel Dennett's book, where you remember when Dennett was sort of saying like we need to have like a department of like cultural health, where we have like government boards that sort of review what people sort of consume culturally. And I thought about how kind of gross and weird and messed up that was.
Yeah.
Now, Dennett was arguing from the perspective of an atheist, saying that like we can get more science textbooks, or we can get like religion out of public schools, and like
people believe dumb things. Here's some
evidence for less dumb things. Like I understand that, but the problem is look at policy right now. Let's not just even look at Let's not even just look at like the possibilities, but look at what governments are doing right now. Look what's happening in Florida right now. Looking at in what's going on in my home state of Indiana right now. Is you're seeing a lot of these essentially book banning bills, where any books that talk about sexuality or gender identity or race or class, any of those kinds of books are no go. And you're having more and more of these sort of, essentially commissars of cultural health, sort of use like the Soviet term, like they're essentially deciding what people can and cannot read. And I find that to be absolutely unconscionable. It was horrible when the Soviets did it, and it was terrible when Americans do it. It's like, I believe in a free and open exchange of ideas. I genuinely believe in that. I'm not like some Dave Rubin dipshit. I genuinely believe that freedom of thought is essential in a democratic and open society, whether it's socialist or not. And I feel like that's not to say that there aren't consequences for bad speech or saying things that are offensive or harmful. But what it does say is that we live in a society where people are free to read things. Because that's the problem it's like, if have you ever seen the play Inherent the Wind?
I don't think so.
Inherent the Wind is a wonderful, wonderful play. It's based on the Scopes monkey trial. John Scopes, who was a teacher teaching evolution, and he was fined in Tennessee. It's the great court case between Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan in terms of could evolution be taught in schools. There's this great scene in the play where the sort of Clarence Darrow character, who, and I think an earlier movie had been played by Peter Fonda, and in a later film had been played by Jack Lemmon. I like the Jack Lemmon one because I think Jack Lemmon's great. But basically says is that, if you can make it illegal to not teach something, then you can make it essentially illegal to hear about it or to read about it. And then you can start banning books, and you can start doing this. And that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Florida or what's going on in Indiana or other states around the country that are trying to do this, where they're trying to systematically purge schools and libraries of books that they find objectionable, it's essentially no discernible difference from what fascists did in the 1930s. When they burned books, when they burned research on sexuality and transgender, the transgender experience in Nazi Germany. It's indistinguishable from that. These people are fascists. And I think that, I think it's maybe, I can't remember who said it, but it's like, the people who are willing to burn books will someday be willing to burn people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so this is where I have very firm disagreements with Michael Lind. I do not, and Daniel Dennett too.
Right.
In that I genuinely believe that, that it is harmful to a society to say what people can and cannot read, to say what they can or cannot watch on television, to say what they can and cannot listen to on a podcast or on YouTube, to say what they can or cannot read, and I think it's really harmful to our society to do some of that. Now, I will say this, it's a nuanced issue. So for example, like, do I want fascists openly throwing death threats at people on Twitter? No.
Right.
Because that's actively producing harm. I think there are reasonable limits to speech, and that's always been the case in the United States. I mean, we have the First Amendment, but the First Amendment has limits. You don't just get to defame someone and lie about someone. There are consequences for that.
If you have a society or a culture that is reasonably educated, and actually isn't force-fed propaganda 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, like the U.S. is.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
You can let people read anything, and they'll either reject it or realize the problems with it because they have critical thinking abilities.
And essentially, this leads to a position where the government is making those decisions for you.
Right.
And oftentimes, the people who are in our government in the United States are far-right, white nationalist Christian fascists.
Yeah, like even farther right than the population.
Oh
is
my
in
God,
any way,
yes.
right?
I think you could find even people who identify as conservatives who would often be appalled at what they're trying to do in schools.
Yeah.
One organization here in the United States that's sort of, nominally libertarian is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very much against this kind of shit.
Right. They were the ones that, like, they used to make a big hullabaloo about the college kids on campus protesting and shutting down speakers. But yeah, their whole thing is free speech, right?
Yeah.
So it would be inconsistent, I guess, for them to do anything other than be against these book banning.
And I appreciate the consistency, because it's often rare on the right to find that level of consistency. But I think it's important because Lynn's, like, what he tries to argue in the book is, like, you have, like, essentially, like, this, like, cultural, like sort of cultural organization sort of overviews and sees material that's developed for public consumption. Right. And he says, like, well, we should have, like, like maybe a lawyer on it, and maybe like a priest and a rabbi and blah, blah, blah. Of course, no mention of people who are humanists like you and me, no mention of anybody who are atheists or agnostics or, nominally non-religious. Cause of course, we're just, or even like,
probably even like minority religions that are generally found in other countries, but there is a population in the US, so they should be recognized.
And so, like, we're not recognized. And so it's sort of reviewing materials. And I find that is, that's not an amount of authority on issues that I'm willing to really give the government on. I just don't feel comfortable with that. Yep. And I know that maybe makes me sound like a right winger, but I really actually feel that it's, it's, I actually feel like that's being consistent in terms of, like, I want to live in a society which guarantees and grants people the most amount of freedom possible within reasonable limits. Yeah. Right. Like, and when I say freedom, I don't mean in sort of like the sort of crappy right wing context. I mean, like, genuinely build a society where people don't just get to vote for who runs the country, but they also get to vote on what's going on in their workplace. Right. That, like, we have a society where people, like, democracy is spread farther than merely just to elections for public leaders, but is actually, dedicated to the process of democratization on a wide scale. And I think the way you do that is by having a free and independent press and a free and independent, system of cultural reproduction. And again, that's not to say that there aren't limits. Like, there's tons of self-censorship in the media. There's tons of self-censorship in newscasting. We talked about that when we talked about Michael Parenti's book. Obviously, Noam Chomsky has written about this. Right. There's tons of
social consequences are a thing, right?
Social consequences are a thing. And there's also consequences as a result of capitalism, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the example that Parenti has in his book is, it's like, imagine that you work for a newspaper, which is owned by a corporation that just so happened to poison a river, like somewhere in the United States. And you want to do investigative reporting on, this company that has poisoned a river. And the company comes to you and says, look, we don't believe in censorship. We don't want to censor you. We don't want to censor you. We just want to be on the same team. And, we want to just make sure that our interests are best represented here. Yeah. So I don't want to censor you, but I just want to make sure we're on the same team. And it's that kind of, like, weird, creepy.
The guy who owns the paper is literally going to fire you.
He's going to fire you if you do this. That's a form of censorship, right? And, like, when I say, like, a free and independent press, like, I don't think it's mutually exclusive to have a sort of, to have sort of publicly run, publicly owned news services,
right,
and have a certain level of sort of editorial independence and discretion. Like, I don't think those are mutually exclusive, right? And in a socialist world that I would like to live in, we would have public news services, which obviously have their own limitations, but robust public news services that can't be captured by big philanthropy, which is kind of what happens with like PBS and NPR. I always make the joke that NPR is basically Fox News for people who like to hike and eat kale. There's a lot of right-wing crap on NPR, mind you. One of the biggest funders of PBS was the Kochs.
Right.
So it's like there is a lot of corporate capture even within public broadcasting.
Yeah.
So to have truly independent broadcasting, you would have to do a fully public model where it's either funded by the government in the form of subsidies and special grants, or it's funded by the public. Like generally.
You still because we have the CBC here in Canada, which is a government funded news service. And in some ways it's very good. Mm-hmm. But then in other ways, it's like the propaganda arm of the government.
Right.
So you got to be
it's
careful
like the BBC.
about that too.
There's like good journalism mixed in with like, if the Tories are in power, the Tories are going to get a little less of a shakedown.
Yeah.
The Labour's in power, they're going to get a little more of a shakedown. Like, or in Canada's case, like if the Liberal Party's in power, they're going to get a little less of a grilling than say maybe the Conservatives, right? And vice versa.
Yeah.
That's to be expected. Those problems are there. And I'm not going to say that they aren't, but like, I genuinely believe that like, it's still better than the sort of corporate, the corporate news. The problem with our culture is not, the problem with our culture industry in America is not necessarily that it's woke or some shit like that. No, the real problem is that it is corporate concentration, which values shareholder return rather than creating, cultural products that are meaningful to people.
Which means, on one hand, if you have anti-racism be a popular seller for your paper or your articles or what have you, that will be what they promote. But also if you have transphobia be a popular seller of your papers and memberships and whatnot, then that will be the big seller.
Exactly.
So you get, it's not woke, it's capitalism.
It's capitalist, right. And so when people say, oh, well, it's woke capitalist. No, it's just capitalist. This is what capitalism does. Yeah. It absorbs radical energies and neutralizes them.
Yeah.
And sort of co-ops them for their own good. No shit. We've been saying that forever. Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman wrote about it years ago. Michael Parenti wrote about it years ago.
Yeah.
And even less radical people have talked about this kind of crap, whether it's, some like Keith Olbermann, who used to be on MSNBC. He talked about this all the time about how that essentially when MSNBC was owned by General Electric, when he worked there, his podcast today, he talked about how the CEO of General Electric basically kind of gave him a shakedown and said, like, look, I don't want to censor you, but I'm a GE guy and I have to do what's best for GE. Yeah. Well, no shit. If you're the CEO of General Electric, you're going to do what's best for General Electric.
Alec Baldwin's character on 30 Rock was literally that guy.
Exactly, right? Exactly. Like, I have to do what's best for my company. Now MSNBC now and NBC in general is owned by Comcast.
Right.
So it's in the business of Comcast, right? Yeah. Like Vox.com, the sort of centrist, sort of the leading sort of center left publication in America. There's I think a majority stake by Comcast. Like, they partially own it, right?
Right.
And Bill Gates has a stake, which is why you'll never see Vox write a shitty article about him.
Yeah.
Like, generally. And so like these are the ways in which corporate influence can sort of pervert and distort how we're understanding reality. As Michael Parenti called it, inventing reality. They create in realities, pseudo realities, for us to not pay attention to the other things that are really going on, or giving us a sort of truncated view and not a nuanced view.
Right.
And so I think like the issue of cultural, the issue of like cultural reproduction is much more complicated than I think Lynn gives it credit for.
Right.
And then also like, I think building a robust, to pivot back to the immigration issue, like I think to build a robust social democratic or socialist society is one where we don't have to have limitations on immigration. And if anything, and here's the bigger point, right? If the United States decided to basically move away from being an empire to being genuinely a democracy, that we wanted to be a democratic system, we would close down a lot of our military bases. We would lower our military budgets. We would start investing in our country. We would try to stop conflicts instead of starting them. Yeah. Like, a cultural shift will happen. A lot of the reason why so many people in Central and South America come to the United States is precisely because of the political conditions that our country has created by backing dictators, by carrying out coups, by destabilizing regions. And this is not something that's yesterday. One of the first things that happened under the Obama administration was a coup in Guatemala That was one of the first ones. And so, no, not Guatemala. It was Honduras. My bad. It was Honduras. Guatemala was in the 50s. But it was Honduras in 2009. We destabilized that country. Look at Venezuela, for example. Now, obviously, Venezuela has its own share of issues. We can talk about like, the level of democratic control in that country. But like the fact the United States has tried to institute regime change there is not good. Same with Iran. And like, so of course people are coming to America because it's the only place that they can ever be guaranteed they're not going to get bombed or shot or like
by
harmed
America
or sold into open slave markets like in Libya. Like you have to go to the belly of the beast to be saved by it.
Yeah, that's right.
So like if the United States was genuinely interested in global peace and security, we would sort of change our policy. And then not only would it be good to have people come here, because I genuinely believe it's good to have other people come here.
Yeah.
But also, it's really good, if enough people can build their countries and be left alone and not have to be sort of under the capricious arm of American imperialism, they'll stay there.
Yep, that's right.
Like they'll build their countries and they won't have to come to the United States. Not that we wouldn't want them. If they wanted to come, I'd be gladly welcome them.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
But because they've not been given that choice.
Yeah, that's right.
And so if you could give them that choice, or at the very least, stay the fuck out of it. Like, it's not your choice to give.
That's right. Yeah. Just let them do the thing they want to do.
Let them build their own countries, right?
Don't
Isn't that
interfere.
the argument the United States is saying about Ukraine right now?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Then that should extend to other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's my whole issue is I do believe we can have an open and democratic or socially democratic or socialist system, and we can have I think reasonable immigration. I don't think anybody anytime soon is advocating for like fuck them, borders, fuck them. Like, and even if you are, you're making that from a very specific and principled position, right? Like you're arguing like the way for us to get to this world where borders are arbitrary and it doesn't really mean anything. We have to rebuild the entire world in a new image in order to get there. Yeah. And so because and I think that there is, because one of the core freedoms, and we talked about this when we talked about David Graeber's book, the Dawn of Everything, is freedom of movement. The freedom to say, I don't want to live here anymore. I want to move somewhere else. I'm just becoming a ghost. I'm sorry. My lights are a problem tonight. But yeah, I mean, it's just to say, I don't want to live here anymore. I want to live somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I think people should have that right. I think that's a fundamental human right, is freedom of movement. Yeah. And I think that immigration restrictions are a real threat to human freedom. And quite frankly, I think they're bad economics too.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think that, if you look at a lot of the innovations in American capitalism, obviously we can talk about a lot of it is state sponsored. And, I think Mariana Mazzucato's written about this, and most of the technology in the iPhone were created with public research. And that's obviously true. I'm not going to say it isn't. But if you look at a lot of the innovative waves of whether it's in Silicon Valley or wherever, a lot of this is done by folks who came here from other places, right? Yeah. And so, like Sergey Brin of Google, right?
I always think of, I always think of like we also in Canada have a very large anti-immigration kind of movement in the conservative side of things. But, we as Canada is a very small country, and we have to have a population growth faster than we're having babies in order to stay economically viable within the global system.
Yeah.
We have to increase our immigration just to stay above the water.
Absolutely. Because the population of Canada is what 30 million, 35
roughly,
million?
Yeah.
So the United States is 330 million, right? So, and the United States is also in that position. Right. Now, Lind in the book will argue that that's largely a myth, but I don't think it is. Yeah. I genuinely think that, we're in a situation where the boomers, the baby boomers are going to be the biggest retired generation in the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. These are people born between 1945 and 1960 or 65, depending on when you make the cutoff, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Most of these people are either on Social Security now or they are going to be in Social Security. Now, here's the thing. You are never going to hear me do fear-mongering on Social Security on this podcast.
Right.
I love Social Security. We should expand Social Security. I think
vital.
that it is absolutely vital.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that the way that we make it vital for the future is that we have a workforce.
Yeah. When
Social Security was started, I think the employee to beneficiary ratio was like 37-1. Right. That was in 1935 was when Social Security Act was passed. First recipients of Social Security were I think in 39 or 40. It was a few years after. So, but today it's like 2 or 3 to 1.
Right.
And at some point it'll be 1 to 1. And you can't make that work under existing conditions.
Yeah, that's right.
But don't let anybody do any fear mongering on Social Security.
It's not, it's not Social Security that's the problem.
It's not Social Security that's the problem. And it's not the problem for 2 reasons. I'm going to explain these briefly. And I want to credit where I'm getting this information from. One is Sam Cedar from the Majority Report, who I like very much. The other one is Robert Reich, The Economist. One thing about Social Security people need to know is that under federal law, Social Security cannot add to the federal deficit. That is by law. So the Social Security Trust Fund has never added to the deficit by law. So when anybody says, oh my God, look at how much Social Security is adding to the deficit, that's bullshit. By law, it doesn't. Yeah. Okay. The trust fund is an independent entity, which the United States government has sort of dipped into from time to time, like the war in Iraq, and then decided basically not to pay it back.
Yeah.
But here's where I get to point 2, and here's the solution to Social Security. In the United States, there is an income threshold. There's an income cap on who pays into Social Security in the United States.
Which I believe we've talked about before.
We've talked about before. So it's like $166,000 or something like that. Yeah. Anything over that is not taxed with Social Security.
Yeah.
End the cap.
Yeah.
It's that simple. Kill the cap. That's all you'd have to do is just kill the cap. And you would have, as Bernie would say, millionaires and billionaires. You'd have the millionaires and billionaires, the people who have gotten away with hoarding more wealth and paying a less fair share of their taxes over the last 40 years.
Yeah.
And Social Security would be solvent forever.
Yeah.
You would never have to worry about it. And that's what I'm talking about in general. So I apologize to our viewers if this episode is a little kind of all over the place, but part of it's because this book sucks. And I wanted to use it as a springboard to talk about other things.
Yeah. So then we had to talk about things that he touched on in the book.
Things that he touched on in the book, because essentially what he's arguing for is a social democratic United States, which is also increasingly anti-immigrant and essentially like anti-change.
Right.
I don't know if this guy has done trans panic stuff yet, but he's definitely done like woke panic stuff for sure. And that drives me nuts.
Yeah.
So I think I think it's important to recognize that there is like a real sort of managerial system in the United States that is extremely it's extremely unequal. It's extremely hierarchical. And it's disastrous for not just our economy, but for democracy. It's not good to have, if you want to have like a really genuinely open and free system that people can flourish in, it can't be where you have a very small amount of people on the top who essentially make decisions for everybody else.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's a true component of what his book says. The problem is that, again, you cannot muddy the waters about capitalist relations.
Right.
The problem is capitalism. It's not necessarily, the managerial elite. Well, the managerial elite are only doing what they're doing
they work for somebody.
Because they work for someone. Because the capitalists who own them and own their asses make them do it.
Yeah, that's
It's the incentive structure, And so I think, I think that it's important for us to know that understanding the working class is important. You are unless you are an owner, you are a worker.
And I think, maybe I'm incorrect on this, but it seems to me that a lot of CEOs, the really, really high up in corporations are often really they're also owners.
Yes.
They're not, there's no line between those or, the guy who makes 100 million bonus because the company did okay. And he just also happens to own a bunch of stock in that company.
Yes. A lot of the high up executives or managers, they will often get stock options as a form of compensation because it's easier for the firm to do that. The other thing too is that it's often either less taxed or not taxed at all.
Yeah, that's right.
Because what a lot of rich people do is a lot of rich people, in order to keep their balance sheets sort of kind of keep their income off the books so that it doesn't really get taxed the way our income or your income is taxed. What they'll do is essentially they'll take out a loan and they're using their stock as collateral.
Right.
And they live on the loan. And then you pay the loan and it essentially looks like you have no income, even though you do.
Yeah.
Like,
and then they don't pay, there's no tax on capital gains.
Yep.
So as your stock increases, you don't have to actually pay taxes on that. Like, so you're just always ahead.
You're always ahead, right? And so the managerial, and I think like, interestingly enough, not only does this like managerial elite thing, like it not only muddies the waters about capitalist relations, it is also like a indirect flattener. So it basically treats like the CEO of like a Fortune 500 company as the same as like your mid-level manager at like some like industrial firm.
Not the same.
Those are not the same thing. Like they're very, very different. As you said, CEOs often get compensation in the form of stock. They're partially owners, right? And so when you just call them the managerial class, it ignores the real distinction, which is that a lot of times they are owners. They are the capitalist class. That's right. And so they have an incentive to keep the system going as it is. And I just, like I said, I think that ultimately, like for me, Michael Lynn's like policy prescriptions are very top down. And I look at what has worked in the United States and what has worked before. Social movements don't just happen. Like real change in a society doesn't just happen from the top down. It happens from the bottom up. It happens from social movements of working class people who say enough is enough and they fight back and they build a better system or they fight to build a better system and they force those at the top to change.
And despite not being able to destroy capitalism at any point yet, we have seen many like the 8-hour workday, holidays, weekends, like things that are the product of that social movement coming from the ground up going, we want things to change. So
without a doubt. And like, look, like just having social democracy is not the end of my horizon.
Right.
It's the start of my horizon. Like for me, it seems like if you can make this system less humane. And one of the ways you do that is by building a robust social democratic government and system that is, that also has really strict guardrails of what capital can and cannot do. And that goes along with, with public subsidies and incentives for worker cooperatives and building that sort of citizen democracy, that citizen economy that I would like to live in. And then, eventually that builds into something else. And then maybe we can have anarchism, or we can start with anarchism and go whatever, I'm just I don't want to say like I'm trying to be realistic because I'm not. Like what I'm just trying to say is there are multiple different approaches to this, all of which are better than what he's offering. and
all of them are better than this guy.
Almost all of them are better than what he's offering, with the exception of like fascism.
Right.
But the thing is the reason I wanted to talk about this book was one of the, how books often come with blurbs from people.
Yep.
The top blurb on the back of the book was J.D. Vance.
Oh yeah. That's like J.D. Vance, and Associates.
and Associates, yeah. So J.D. Vance, the guy who's the senator from Ohio now, to my chagrin, and to America's, honestly. What they're trying to do is, I think Michael Lynn's like policies are going to get more play in the Republican Party than they are in the Democratic Party.
Right.
Especially the anti-immigration stuff. I think we're going to be seeing a Republican Party in America it's going to kind of go through this weird transitional period where it's going to have to decide, are you the party of free markets and free trade and deregulation, or are you the party of like sort of economic nationalism and the protective tariff and immigration restrictions? And it seems to me like the future of the Republican Party is actually the latter and not the former. I think that in the United States, we're going to see a sort of realignment where the Republican Party is going to become the party of sort of like protectionism and immigration restrictions mixed with a cultural conservatism, whereas like the Democratic Party will move more and more towards, even if it's not neoliberal, it's sort of still more of the sort of free trade, freer markets, but mixed with broader sort of social democratic leanings or progressive ideas and sort of, sort of nominally pro marginalized communities, but not really willing to interrogate the ways in which capitalism actually oppresses those marginalized identities. And I think that that's going to make our politics a lot worse.
Yeah.
But that's also part of why I wanted to read the book, because it was published in 2020. And I really feel like if you looked at a lot of with the Republican Party lately, it's moving more and more towards the sort of economic protectionism and sort of cultural conservatism, which is kind of what Michael Lind has on offer. And so, I think it's disastrous for politics, because it basically says that, the Republican Party might have good policies on like specific things, whether it's domestic manufacturing production or, like, for example, like Trump basically coming out and being very, very firm about like the debt ceiling debate in this country cannot be about Social Security. Like,
right.
You don't dare do it. And it's been interesting to watch the Republicans, some of like Nikki Haley or Mike Pence,
all of a sudden
others,
they pretend they haven't been trying to attack Social Security.
or they're like, right, they have to kind of like, they have to lie, or they have to sort of obfuscate, or they sort of have to talk around the issue because they don't want to piss Trump off. But what Trump is doing is good politics. It just is. Like, everybody likes Medicare and Social Security, like, and especially older people who vote Republican. Like, it's so silly to me. So, it's a bad, but the thing is, but then you have Democrats, more sort of centrist or corporate Democrats who are very pro, like, reform of Social Security, like Joe Manchin and shit. So I think this realignment is going to be bad for American democracy in general.
Yeah.
My hope is that, that maybe, again, we're going to have to build like, actual working class movements. We're going to have to raise unionization.
Right.
Michael Lind says that a lot in his book, he argues that a lot of the hope for building a better future in America is through unions. And I agree with him 110%. Yep. I think that the way in which we do build that more social democratic or socialist world is through building trade unions that have significant power over the economy, so that if the ruling class wants to do some real fucked up shit, then they can just go, oh, you want to try that? Have fun. We're striking, and be done with it. Yeah. And I think that kind of real hard power is important. And it can't just be done through a political party.
You got to get the government out of the way, though.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, you're fucking right. So here's how you're right. Okay. So in the 1940s in the United States, there was something called the Taft-Hartley Act, which passed.
I think I've heard of that. Taft
stands for Robert Taft, who was William Howard Taft's son, senator from Ohio, real piece of shit. And what Taft-Hartley did, and Taft-Hartley was passed by Congress and vetoed by President Truman. Truman knew it was a bad policy. Mm-hmm. One of his rare moments of good judgment. One of his moments of clarity, moments of good judgment. And they passed it over his veto. And what it did was it basically hobbled unions in America. Yeah. And it did it under the guise of anti-communism. At the time, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is part of the AFL-CIO today, the CIO was heavily organized by members of the Communist Party. It is unequivocal. That is exactly what happened. And so, and it was for good. Like, I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
Right.
That was a good thing. That they built this real militant union that could really fight for people. Yeah. And especially black workers. And what Taft-Hartley did was it made it much, much harder in America to start a union, to do the union election process, to even talk to people about starting a union in your workshop. Like, it was just, it made it much, much harder. And so ever since that policy was passed in the 1940s, because you see the peak of unionization in America in essentially like the 1950s. It's around that mark. About a third of the American workforce was unionized by the 1950s, which was good for all Americans, because whether you're a union or not, your wages will go up if union wages go up. Yeah, like that's just the nature of it, right?
Otherwise, you're
And
going to leave your job and go join a union.
Exactly, right? There was that threat. There was
Yeah.
not just the threat of I'm going to leave this job, you can take this job and shove it, but it was also the I'm going to join a union or I'm going to start a union.
Yeah.
And since the 1960s, we've seen a very precipitous decline in union density in the United States.
Yeah.
So much so that even though 2022 was a record-breaking year for unionization in America in terms of new unions and new members, 225,000 workers unionized in America, our union density still went down.
Right.
So it's about 10%. And a good chunk of that are public sector unions and private sector unions. And I'm not sure if that statistic, that 10%, includes cop unions, which to me are not real unions. But
Right.
we can table that for another day. But I think in order for America to get better, and I think for Canada to get better, because I don't know what union density is like in Canada. It might be a little
I'm
better
not sure what the statistics are, but
is to get that, it's like McConaughey says, you got to get them numbers up. Those are rookie numbers.
That's right.
You got the numbers up. So
Yeah.
if we can see union density grow in the country, we're going to be much better off. And that comes out of doing really good policy.
Yeah.
I am really no fan of Joe Biden. But one thing that the Biden administration has done better has been putting better people on the National Labor Relations Board, which is the governing body of the federal government, which oversees unionization. The NLRB is a good thing. It does its job is to get people unionized. In the last few years, it's done that precisely because we have an NLRB that works now, and it's not as shitty as it was when Trump was president.
Right.
That's a legitimate thing that'll be good.
Yeah.
But again, when you only have 10%, it doesn't have the same kind of power.
Yeah.
And so you have to build that working class power. This is where I very much am leaning more and more towards like reading that libertarian socialism book we're going to discuss in a future episode, thinking about syndicalism and the idea that unions really are the way that we do this. Because I very much agree, like whether we get anarchism, whether we get social democracy, whether we get socialism, it's got to come through the unions.
Right.
And it has to come with political parties that support the unions.
Yeah.
That those have to go hand in hand. And so I think
if you're going to reform the system using like the democratic systems that kind of exist now, then you absolutely need support. You need a commingling of the union and the party.
Yes, without a doubt. And I think that that's where our future lies. And I think that those are all things that where I think in some respects Linda would agree, but like you and I take it further. Like we're just more radical on it in the sense that like I know I want socialism. Like I am a socialist. Like I want democratic control of the economy. Right. I want nationalization. I want decommodification. Like I think all of those things will make a better world.
Yeah.
And I think that we can do all of those things and we can have, better immigration policy in this country. That's not so disgusting and inhumane and horrible. And we can also, build that social democratic system that can benefit people without having to sacrifice anything.
Yeah.
That's the problem. We live in an age where we're constantly told we have to sacrifice.
Yeah.
But the rich are fucking never told to sacrifice a goddamn thing.
No, it's just us.
It's just us who are told to suffer. We're the ones who have to tighten our belts. Well, fuck that. And so building working class power starts with recognizing that, if you don't own it, you work for it.
Yeah.
And so this whole managerialism thing muddies the waters, and I think we should just pitch it.
Yeah.
So when he says the new class war, dude, it's old class war, bro. New war, same as the old war. It's new boss, same as the old boss. That's right. Yeah. It's the same old class war. Know. Yeah. I'm a class warrior. I will tell you that right now. And I'm on the side of the working class. I want the working class to win. I don't just want to fight the war. I want to win it. And that's like the difference.
Yeah. And we can't win it by dividing us up into these smaller sections. I
agree 100%. And trying to make distinctions without real differences. Because we're just not in a position to do that right now. Yeah. We're just not. And I know we'll talk more about that when we talk about the Libertarian Socialism book. And so overall, I think that this book is kind of a muddled mess. I think it's both it's utopian in the sense that his ideas are often quite divorced from reality, but also just like, but also it's failure of vision. That it's I think you can be you can have a much more expansive vision of what is possible, because that's what we're going to have to get to where we want to go.
Right.
Is to think bigger than what we've done in the past and stop being so hampered by, oh, well, this is as best as it's going to get. I have to work through this system. It's like, no, you don't. Like, we can change it. We can make it better. And so I think people, you don't have to read this book. I read it in 2 days. It's
okay.
It's like a couple hundred pages. And it's basically like a long magazine article, and it kind of reads like it. But I think if you want to get a more left critique of what he's trying to get at, I highly recommend people check out the book Virtue Hoarders. I don't agree with everything in that book, but I can't remember who wrote it. Maybe Catherine Liu. I can't remember who wrote that book, but Virtue Hoarders is kind of the same kind of vibe that Lynn's going for, but it's actually of the left. It's a real leftist critique of like the sort of neoliberal identity politics. That has sort of pervaded our culture, that is, I think, really harmful in the sense that it doesn't actually give a shit about marginalized communities.
Right.
And just uses them as
and
uses them as sort of props for its own agenda. It's like, it's the sort of like Black Lives Matter brought to you by Bank of America. It's
or rainbow capitalism.
Like, I think those are all a problem. But I think the way in which people like Lind, who are sort of, I think, in the more reactionary set, write about it, is equally destructive because, cops are coming for somebody.
Your place isn't on fire?
No, I'm good. But yeah, so, and so my whole thing is, it's like, I just don't think it's a great book, but, it is fine. I think it was interesting to read. Every once in a while, it's fun to read something and be like, wow, I really like that. Whoa, I really hated that. Like, it's interesting because this book was like jerking me all over the place. Like, the first half of it, where he's like diagnosing the problem and kind of explaining the problem of neoliberalism, I'm like, I'm with you, bro, 100%. Yeah, it's the second half where he gets into his policy prescriptions, where I'm like, whoa, we are off the deep end, man. Like, I don't agree with this, especially the anti-immigration stuff.
Right. So I guess we've talked about it a few times. What are we covering next time?
Next time, we're going to be covering the book Libertarian Socialism, Politics in Black and Red. It's got multiple editors on it. It's a collection of essays that sort of looks into the intersection of anarchist and Marxist thought. This book is absolutely right up my alley. I'm about 4 or 5 chapters in. I'm really digging it. I think a lot of my own politics really gels with it. And it's going to be exciting to discuss that book. And I can't wait. It's going to be fun.
For sure. And I guess the only thing that's left is, where can people find you?
So people can find me at justinclark.org. That's my website. All my writing and podcast episodes are all available there. And then you can also follow me on Instagram at justinclarkph, PH for public history. I'm still on my Instagram. I'm still continuing my Gore Vidal retrospective series. And I'm just also sort of posting random things here and there. So, that's where you guys can find me.
Awesome. And I'm not sure why, but the videos have not been staying up on Twitch for the 14 days.
Okay.
But so far, I've been lucky and I've been getting these up relatively quickly. So this should be up.
No, you've been a dynamo lately. You've been kind of kicking ass and stuff out.
It's going to take a bit of a hit for the next little bit because we're moving now. So
hey, man, take your time. That's fine. And one thing I do also want to mention for folks is, if you're not a patron already, definitely become a patron. It's Mind the Skeptical Leftist, right?
Yep. Mind is patreon.com/skepticalleftist.
And the link will be in the description
yes.
And all that jazz, but definitely become a patron. Cory does an incredible amount of work here. He's not just co-hosting the show with me. He does his interview series. He's doing some really interesting, commentaries now, like leftist theory, and he's doing some debunking the news stuff. He's really doing some really interesting stuff, y'all. So if you want to support his work, definitely support him on Patreon. I'm a patron too. I think it's important because he makes it so easy for me to come in and do this show, which I love to do. So
right on. And my rent just went up, so I need the money.
Exactly. Dude's got to eat, man. Dude's got to eat. Not only does dude got to eat, dude got to have the roof over his head for his family.
That's
you know?
right.
I don't have any kids. I just have a cat. You know, it's easier for me. You know, because Kaylee and I are what the acronym is DINKS. We're dual income, no kids.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it's you know when you're taking care of kiddos, it's a whole different situation. So yeah, definitely become a patron.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for your time, Justin.
Thanks, Corey. It's been great.
All right, that's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me survive, which is essentially the only way that projects like this can continue for me. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticalleftist. If you can't contribute financially, then a like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check the show notes for links to all my stuff and to check out my website, skepticalleftist.com. There you can find the videos I do with my friend Damien Marie Athope and all my old content from the Brainstorm podcast, Skeptarchy, and from my newly retired show, From Many People's Strength. You can also find links to my Discord, Reddit, and Twitch. You can contact me through my website or by emailing mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. My Twitter is @skepticallefty. My Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, and my Mastodon is collectiva.social/@skepticalleftist. Thanks so much for listening and or watching, and make sure to leave a comment on the video or on my website. Join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda.